Welcome to this episode of Abide in Me, How Jesus Models Secure Attachment with God. This series is a survey of the Gospel of Mark, looking for how Jesus models what is now called secure attachment, which is the physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual experience of what is often called salvation or regeneration or being conjoined with God or enlightenment, individuation, even becoming spiritual. Through the series, we will discover the benefits of becoming securely attached with God, which is the transformation of one's life into one of joy and satisfaction. So we continue in the third chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and we find Jesus is inside of a house with his closest followers, but there's a crowd gathered outside, and his family, we're told, he's there, they try to take him away, saying he's out of his mind. What a sad circumstance to arise, this conflict within the family. And then at the same time, teachers of the religious law had arrived from Jerusalem, and these were people that were trying to maintain the purity of the doctrine so that they could be seen as the teachers. And they say that Jesus is possessed by Satan, the prince of demons. And Jesus responds with these perfect stories that show the error of those teachers' ways. He really puts them down and accuses those teachers of actually being evil. And he says then to the people in the house, that mother and brothers and sisters are not those people out there. He says, anyone who does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. We need to back up for a little minute here and remind ourselves that this story is about connecting human beings together and connecting human beings with God. And we are wired to be connected to other human beings. And we are supposed to do that from our heart, from a sense of self choosing to be connected. And that's what makes an actual connection, not a robotic one or a mechanical one or merely blood connection. To be able to do that implies that we have the freedom and the ability to reject that connection, and that there is therefore the possibility of that connection being wounded or even destroyed. This is sad, and it's scary that we could lose that contact. Because remember, ages ago, if you weren't part of the tribe, you might die. So resolving that sadness and being available for relationship despite that fear is going to be the experience of a full, whole, transformed human life. So I'm saying here that Jesus models this reframing and this resolve. He makes an effort to distinguish the source and the motives of the challenges to relationships with people. And we'll see in other stories, it's also the challenges in his relationship with his father. And he wants to maintain his safety, his sense of his own value and sanctity and the identity of himself, while at the same time promoting a path to the establishment of relationships or the recovery of harm to relationships. Now, you and I know that family squabbles are normal, right? There's a contention for limited resources sometimes, like seconds of dessert, right? Or who gets grandmama's bureau? Or when we compare life achievements, who's making more than the others. And then there are emotional wounds that can be caused by flawed parenting when they make mistakes. And that can play out in arguments amongst the adult children of those parents. It must be common for one sibling to report to someone that their brother's crazy, right? In my experience is that it's more common for family ties, for bonds of love, to be able to see and feel and work through such woundings and failings. I think it's more often that there are no large or long-term problems among family members. So I think it's common for families to be blood relatives to actually have these bonds that are effective and helpful. Going back to the story, we know that Jesus loved and respected his mother to the very end of his life. So he cannot here be dismissing her or his siblings. He's modeling for us a new way of being in relationship with others, to experience secure attachments, to heal our wounds. And to do that, we have to find a way to rise above the limited view that blood establishes connections, to follow God's will, to love others, to accept being loved, to do authentic good for your brother and sister and mother, to love the truth. These are the bonds that bring us together because they are chosen and they are spiritual and they are developed in the course of our living. So, of course, family is more important to be valued. And of course, we care for our families even when they are in distress, even when we have a story about them, right, that impacts our relationship. Jesus is saying that the source of real bonds between people is our secure attachment bond with ourself, with our God, our creator, the source, which establishes our relationships with each other. And the family comes and says, "You're crazy." And Jesus doesn't avoid it or dismiss it. He knows that this is a model for how he could be in relationship with these people. And he's not simply going to dismiss them or avoid it, even though it feels like a rejection of love or destruction of bonds. It must be what we call evil, right? To deny another person's spirit or their goodness, to deny their value, to reject them as human beings, to make oneself more right or more good than another, that's what destroys bonds. That's what is so hurtful and so scary and so sad. The Gospel's author is here recounting a story that is fear-mongering, right? Of using our justifiable fear of the ultimate monster of evil, of abandonment, of being rejected, to illustrate what defenders of dogma had become, very afraid and defensive of losing their power. And so Jesus is here modeling transparency and vulnerability. He's acknowledging the wounds in his family while courageously standing for human value. We all want to be able to stand in the face of these negative emotions, these false beliefs driving another's behaviors and words that might be directed at us. We want to be able to effectively subdue them so that there may be peace and love in the home and in the community. This is a quest that we're wired to go on, to acquire this discernment and use it in love, and so fulfilling our attachment needs. And here's a wonderful circumstance that arises out of the literal story. Being in a house is a symbol for, it's representative of being in one's right mind, being rational, being emotionally intelligent, knowing one's boundaries and remembering them, right? And staying in one's boundaries and not being triggered, not being reactive to what is going on outside the house. So Jesus is modeling this balance of care for our spiritual life and our physical life by teaching and healing indoors and out, right? By caring for our family while maintaining that the bond is established by these spiritual chosen ways of being in relationship. And the story has this delightful irony that Jesus' radical sanity, his self-care, his care for others, attracts the resistance of those in power, of the rigid dogmatists, and even his family. He can challenge the current conditions and practices and beliefs, but he is always intentional and mindful, seeking to repair and restore relationships. That's what we want to find out how to do. And it's a process. The experience of ownership of ourself, of our ideas and our feelings is part of the core of our humanity. As we experience that ownership as a shared experience, it becomes a bonding experience with another person. We feel at peace. We feel fulfilled and blessed. And we all have this well-being potentially from our creation. And yet, for it to develop requires a process. Because we all know we begin with a selfishness, a selfish ownership. We see that in children when they believe that a toy cannot be shared, right? This is not sinful. It's a developmental stage. It does not condemn us to a lonely, narcissistic, sinful life. Rather, we are set up from creation to experience this process in which we achieve this fullness of humanity, a bonding with another human being by sharing an experience of ownership of thoughts and feelings because we choose it and because it is a spiritual reality, not merely a physical one. So Jesus is here modeling a radical change that happens as we develop this secure attachment style of living. Because first we learn through mindfulness and therapy and being in a loving relationship, we learn how not to react when someone or something reminds us of a story that we have written in our minds or hearts that might come from childhood or from some other wounding. This might be a Satan, as it were, that is part of us, that is making up stories to protect us or to advance our sense of self or to avoid harm or avoid pain from harm we've experienced. But when we begin to doubt that story because of our good experiences in life, we eventually no longer believe that story. Our mother and our brothers are not the stories and parts that are merely manufactured in our experience of the world or in our blood relations, right? The things we have no choice over, who we grow up with, right? The mothers and brothers and sisters are the beloved people who share our heart's desires and our worldview. And so at the completion of any particular cycle of healing that we are going through, we recognize that we are no longer gripped by that story. We're no longer dependent on that old distortion, which had been all powerful, which had determined the dogma of what was true and false. But instead, we learn that we can choose what we want to believe, what we want to love. And that is, in those moments, is when we have that perfect comeback, right? The spot-on retort that comes to mind. And it comes to mind because we are then connected to the source, to God. And the life is flowing freely in a way that gives us clarity and freedom and security in ourselves. Well, this may be a daunting task that is our lifelong task, but I'm hopeful from my experiences that have shown that it's possible. For it is the developmental process that we are wired to go through, even though it is at times sad and scary. It is, as Jesus is modeling here, the way to live this life in a transformed way in which we are securely attached. I pray this has supported your transformative life, whatever practice you have in your life. I want to thank Solomon Keel for his music, and I want to invite you to make a contribution to this work if you wish and are able through the PayPal link. And I invite you to continue to listen to the next episode. You be well.